Bueno, buenos días a todos. Vamos a dar inicio a este encuentro, esta jornada de investigación sobre las sociedades precapitalistas, con la participación de un invitado ilustre, que es el profesor Chris Wickham, de la Universidad de Oxford. Y vamos directamente a abreviar cualquier otra intermediación y le voy a dar la palabra a Chris para que hable. Chris, you can speak now. Thank you.
Okay. Buenos días a todos. Hablaré en inglés porque siento que una parte del aula sea lusófono y por esto no me parece el caso de hablar en mi castellano, en mi español bastante débil. Pero, ok, en inglés ahora hago share screen. ¿Es visible? ¿Es visible?
Sí, yes, okay.
Bueno. In some ways, it ought not to be necessary to give this paper. We know quite a lot about how Italian city communes formed and how they took on increasingly elaborate and self-conscious roles as time went on. But how they actually worked on the ground in their early period is much less clear. It is hinted at by historians rather than directly faced. If I was in Italy, what I say here would be on one level perfectly well known, even if all the same on another level not fully understood. It is more of a problem than people think. So I want to turn the almost known into the actually known in what I say. But there's one further challenge. There were 40 plus autonomous city communes in 12th century northern and central Italy of varying stages of institutional development. What I say about one cannot be considered valid for the others. They were really very different politically, even though Italian cities were and are fairly close to each other and had close relationships with their neighbours, usually hostile. In Tuscany, for example, which had 6 major urban communes, all quite well documented, city leaders in Pisa and Lucca were running regular judicial tribunals by the 1130s, but in Florence and Pistoia, these do not appear until the 1170s, and in Siena and Arezzo, not until the 1190s. Government was obviously different between each of the 6, just given this. So we can't easily generalize. But I will generalize all the same, or try to, so as to set out a coherent account. What I will do first is to give a brief account of what happened politically in 12th century north central Italy, to give you a framework to start with, because not everybody knows it. Then I will problematize it through a single case study, in particular concerning one crucial aspect, to me at least, exactly how early city communes ruled the countryside around them to the extent that they did. So first, what is a commune? The Kingdom of Italy of the 7th to 11th centuries, which was a single unit run by a king, later emperor, from his capital at Pavia, was a coherent structure well into the 11th century, even if the kings were by now German and seldom came south of the Alps, except to receive the imperial crown in Rome. It was ruled through networks of counts and marquesses with the help of bishops, and the process of ruling was focused on city-based judicial assemblies run by counts. In the civil wars after 1080, associated with the investiture dispute between Henry IV and a succession of popes, the coherence of the kingdom broke down and the formal assemblies ended. More and more from 1090 onwards, cities began to rule themselves. first through their own ad hoc assemblies and then under slowly crystallizing, rotating leadership groups from the urban military elite, called in most cities consuls, with their political systems increasingly often from the 1120s, 1130s, called a commune, a commune. These leaderships began, again slowly, to run their own government in more formal ways. So by the 1110s, in the two ports of the kingdom, Genoa and Pisa. By the 1130s, in the old heartlands of political power, of royal political power, Lombardy, Emilia, and Western Tuscany. By the 1140s, in northeast Italy and parts of the west. By the end of the century, in inland Tuscany and Umbria and most of Piemonte. Now, I argued in a book of a decade ago that early consuls and other urban leaders did not have any clear idea that they were doing something new here, even though they really were. They looked backwards to the past, they thought in terms of it, their actions were defensive more than anything else, because someone had to govern, it had better be them, until the middle decades of the 12th century. That hasn't quite convinced everyone in Italy. Some see the early communes in more heroic mode, the Italians finally taking charge of their own destiny. Others, looking back from the late Middle Ages, take communal self-consciousness for granted and can't understand why I should deny it. I think I've achieved more agreement than disagreement, but either way, by the 1150s, 1160s, things soon became different. A new German king emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, from his accession in 1152, had an altogether more ambitious view of his own power and rights. In 1158, in his third visit to Italy, he enacted a series of laws to reinforce his rights in a great old-style assembly at Roncaglia, near Piacenza, with a good deal of Roman law rhetoric and the vocal support of the teachers of the new Roman law studium, the future University of Bologna. The cities uneasily knew he was right. He did indeed have the rights he claimed, as 11th century kings had had. But when he actually exercised them, as 11th century kings had not, first by comprehensively destroying and evacuating Italy's biggest city, Milan, his major opponent, in 1162, and then by exacting a set of new taxes from every other city, friend or foe, it took remarkably little time for the cities to revolt in 1164 and onwards. By 1168, pretty much every city in the north had joined the recently formed Lombard League, which was determined to return to the very hands-off royal politics of the early 12th century. Even deadly enemies joined together to do so, in a kind of backhanded tribute to the effectiveness of the oppression of Barbarossa's German lieutenants in each city. In 1176, a rebuilt Milan defeated Barbarossa in a decisive battle at Legnano, and the war rapidly ended with a truce a year later and a comprehensive peace at the German citium Constans in 1183, which in effect granted each city the autonomy it wanted, although allowing Barbarossa and his son Henry VI to remain as players on the Italian chessboard until Henry's death in 1197. By now, cities were certainly self-conscious institutions. The Lombard League made its own laws in the years around 1170, and so did individual cities. A precocious handful, Genoa, Pisa, and Piacenza, had done so already from the 1130s, but the others followed. Genoa and Pisa certainly knew what they were doing well before Barbarossa, but consciousness had spread, and we find in 1173 the consuls of even Brescia, very far from a precocious commune, saying in a public document when building a new market that, quote, they were reforming the state of the city for the better, unquote. That very consciousness was in effect the direct and rapid results of the Barbarossa Wars, the moment when cities all over the north of Italy realized that they were, by now, by resisting the emperor, having to take charge of their own future. And from here on, cities developed their own independent institutions at different speeds, but all in the same direction. It used to be assumed that the moment of decisive change was when, at varying moments between the 1180s and the 1210s, cities established new leaderships to replace often very divided collectives of local consuls, consisting of annually rotating single rulers called podestà in Italian, in both the singular and the plural, who were, by the 1220s, almost all chosen from outside the city, thus theoretically making them neutral. And there survives a group of etiquette manuals from the 13th century, which set out how podestà should behave, what sorts of speeches they should give, how they should not favour only one urban faction, and so on. The fact that podestà henceforth always came from somewhere else, with different experiences, did mean that cities steadily became less dissimilar to each other in the 13th century, however much they fought each other. And urban institutions became quite a lot more homogeneous. But the arrival of podestà has been overrated as a break. Their single rulership was partially new, but they governed with councils made up of the same military elite families that had provided consuls before, and these, unlike individual podestà, did not change from year to year. So the Italian historian Paolo Grillo argued 15 years ago that the consular commune, as it's called in Italy, had developed solid institutions already. Judicial tribunals, for sure, and in most cities, I've just said so, systematic legislation and urban taxation. That's referred to sometimes as early as the 1120s, but it's generalized by the 1160s. It's more systematically assessed and collected in some places, less systematically in others. It's often not at all heavy, but by now it's normal. So that's where we are at present with respect to 12th century communes. An increasing self-consciousness, slow in the early 12th century, but fast during the Barbarossa Wars, and a steadily developing institutional solidity, more separated from those wars. So where's the problem? I think it comes in the countryside. Your consuls, you have developed a set of judicial practices which are becoming institutions. You know how to govern your city, your rule is accepted there, and you certainly know how to make war on rival cities, which began as soon as the kingdom fell apart and was routine year by year in the early 12th century. But how far does your rule extend in the countryside, what the Italians call your city's contado? And how do you make it effective? Now, there are two issues here. First, cities mostly had ready-made territories in theory, the dioceses of their bishops, which were stable, very often identical to the counties of 11th century counts. These are menaced at the edges by rival cities. And indeed, the wars between cities were overwhelmingly fought on the boundaries of dioceses, with border castles and villages routinely taken or destroyed. So that's one problem you've always had to face. Boundary disputes were, in fact, one of the things the Lombard League was most concerned should be dealt with peacefully, and for a while they often were. The second and more serious problem for cities is that at the same time as they develop into autonomous communes, the same thing happens to autonomous lordships in the countryside. Signorie in Italian, which might be very coherent and oppressive, might alternatively be relatively restricted in the obligations they placed on peasants, but increasingly often in the 12th century had defined territories and certainly routinely involved the same sort of exercises by lords of the judicial and fiscal rights which cities were claiming elsewhere. So urban government is by no means universal. Now, that's well known, and there's a substantial literature on the conquest of the contado, largely taking Florence as a model, as that city subjected lords by violence, castle by castle, across the century and a half from 1130. Or you could take Lucca, From the start, the city had a total hegemony in the small, very fertile plain immediately around it. It easily extended north and east of that by the 1130s. But in the far north of the diocese, the mountain valley of the Garfagnana, there are lords that fought the city off with Barbarossa's support until the 1180s. And along the Arno, the emperor had his own political focus until the 1190s. The city took over both after that. And the southern edge of the diocese was taken over by an expansionist Pisa. But it's not just about war, and it mostly wasn't. For a start, many rural lords are urban living, which made their commitment to autonomy often half-hearted, where it seemed to powerful city dwellers quite as attractive to participate in ruling a city with wide powers as it might be to have one's own small rural power base oneself. Many lords are also urban ecclesiastics, bishops or abbots of urban monasteries, city-based by definition, although these lords are often less submissive to cities. Bishops caused the most trouble, as they had strong views about their own rights, which were harder for cities to oppose militarily. So Parma is an extreme example here. The bishop had a large set of lordships north and south of the city, marked in yellow here, in which he was for long the supreme power. In a large-scale court case of 1218 about episcopal rights between the city commune and the bishop, witnesses listed many recent occasions when the bishop's men punished peasants on the spot for crimes large and small. In a typical Italian pattern, for theft, men were usually hung, whereas for homicide, their houses were burnt down. This summary account was made for the bishop, and so it's not surprising it stresses his continual rights. But it's far from unlikely that villagers preferred law to be done locally by the bishop's men, rather than a city which was not always close. But all of this essentially law-focused set of moves shows that one thing the commune of Parma did not feel it could do was simply send an army to take down the bishop's castles. And in fact, the conflict did not substantially diminish the bishop's powers. Now, the fact that both parties in this Parma example thought it would be best to go to court over communal versus seigneurial rights was far from unique. Now, sometimes it is true communes did think it best to impose their power in the countryside by force. It could be violent, as in Florence, but it could also be not violent, but very one-sided. For example, in the small village of San Marzano on the border between Pavia and Piacenza, subject to the signoria of the monastery of San Sepolcro in Pavia, we have an account of the abbot appearing one day in 1163, accompanied by the consuls of Pavia, saying to the villagers, probably with not much enthusiasm, "You cannot stay as you stayed up till now. Henceforth, the city will control the bishop, and he won't." But this example is recorded in the witnessing in a court case as well, because it's a village contested between Pavia and Piacenza, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, both city communes and local lords wished quite often, at least when it came to standoffs which could not easily be resolved by force, to establish their rights by going to law or arbitration and presenting evidence, which is almost always witnessing. So we have witness depositions, and they can be very numerous and detailed. They can be from city consuls or city officials of other kinds, but usually in a majority, they are the inhabitants of the countryside, largely peasants, witnessing how ruling was carried out. And what they show us, beyond their incidental detail, which is often very fascinating, is two crucial things. First, it mattered to political powers what country dwellers thought about who their rightful lords were. And second, that we, therefore, have some idea what they thought the proofs of legitimate government were. We have the peasant voice, or at least the male peasant voice, for women are almost wholly absent. which tells us what power consisted of. So we've got at least some access to how ruling actually worked and what it felt like from the standpoint of the ruled. So I'll spend the rest of this talk talking about that with relationship to city communal power, what villagers, mostly peasants, thought about what urban government consisted of, how it worked, and what made it legitimate. And that gives us a different perspective. I'm going to give a single example here, the case between Pavia and Piacenza in 1184, and then I will conclude. Now, I can't even summarize this huge case. The surviving testimony by 80 witnesses, it runs to 120 pages in the published edition, and there were more witnesses originally, but I can give a survey of some of its main elements. The case was over quite a small part of the boundary between the two cities, 5 not terribly important villages just south of the River Po: Monticelli, Pieve Parmenese, Olmo, San Marzano, and Mondonico, set north and south of 2 more important and strategic castles, Olubra and Fontana, which were indisputably Piacenza's. The witnessing concerned the last 30 years, not many people remembered longer, which was also exactly the period of the Barbarossa Wars. And these villagers had the ill luck to be near a major road running along the Po, which armies used routinely. Each of the 5 was burnt more than once by these armies, which gave a decided edge to the accounts of the witnesses. They dated events by individual campaigns, as well as by the consuls of the year in the 2 cities. But the wars also provided an additional set of issues to discuss. Routine questions included, which city did you flee to in time of war? That's a sign of identity. Most, although not all, said Pavia. Or else, which army burnt your village? The implication being that if an imperial army did it, which would include troops from Pavia, then the village was concerned to be part of Piacenza's territory. But an army from the Lombard League, which included Piacenza, would imply the opposite, although these implications are not always accurate, for armies burnt villages anyway. That Pavia and Piacenza were almost always on opposing sides of a wider war, of course, made the situation worse. But the 2 cities had chosen to come to terms peacefully here by arbitration after the witnessing, in the first year after the Comprehensive Peace of Constance. We don't have the arbitration, but it didn't finally resolve the issue. The villages changed sides more than once thereafter. But the witnessing is anyway more important because it shows what happened in practice before 1184. Anyway, who might have been in the right was as disagreed about locally as it was between the cities. Broadly, Mondonico was the most pro-Piacenza village. San Marzano was the most opposed to Piacenza. The other 3 were more matter of fact. They tend to Pavia. The set of witnessing is divided between pro-Pavia and pro-Piacenza witnesses, but those from the villages themselves said much the same things on each side, which helps our confidence in the main lines of their claims, even when they disagree or even when they lie. The proofs of rule that the witnesses were asked about were quite typical of those in other cities. The consuls of Pavia or Piacenza could each raise consuls of the local rural commune, which meant choosing them and making them swear loyalty to the city and its laws. That's a fairly symbolic process, but it's important symbolism. They also taxed the villages, a tax on heads of cattle called juvaticum or else bovateria, and occasionally a hearth tax of fodrum, plus dues on the movements of goods and mills. They controlled high justice, placita magna, leaving placita minora to rural consuls. They demanded labour service to build local castles and the canals and moats around cities, and also some army service, though not much. And it's interesting that the witnesses mention no one dying in the wars, except for one consul of Piacenza, Guglielmo di Malovicino, whose death on campaign in 1172 is referred to many times as a significant event. In a particularly bad year for harvests, probably 1176, when export of grain out of city territories was forbidden, the cities provided grain rations for country dwellers who came to collect it. Now, these are the typical elements of urban government. We can see them in documents for plenty of cities. But the way they're talked about is interesting, important. And I'll look at three of them in turn: consuls, taxes, and justice. First, consuls. Broadly, Pavia was said to have raised consuls without opposition, quiete, quietly, as many witnesses said, in most of the villages in the 1160s and early 1170s. But after Barbarossa's failed siege of the city of Alessandria in 1175, the situation changed. One witness said simply that the Pavese had maiorem vim, more force, before 1175, and the Piacentini had it after. But the Piacentini had certainly made inroads before that. So in 1160, Guglielmo di Malvicino, already a consul of Piacenza, appeared in the village of Pieve Parpanese and demanded that the inhabitants swear to keep to Piacenza's commands. They refused, saying that they were subject to Pavia. And two witnesses said that they replied, I quote, "No city is accustomed to raise consuls here," unquote, for the villagers had previously raised their own consuls. So Guglielmo insulted them and hit one with his baton of office. And then they were scared and agreed to swear to Piacenza by force, per vim. The next year they defied Piacenza, expelled the consuls of the city who had come to raise local consuls, but the city's leaders returned with armed men and they gave in again. The story of Guglielmo di Malvicino and his baton was repeated in identical terms by witnesses discussing San Marzano. Clearly, he had chosen to do the same thing in different villages. But almost everyone had a narrative which involved the consuls of Piacenza making steady inroads into the process of raising local consuls, particularly after 1175, by force. Many witnesses said that the two cities in this recent period raised consuls in the villages in competition. That is to say, consuls or other officials came yearly and raised the local consuls. But several witnesses also made it clear that what that meant was that in the last 4 or 5 years, Piacenza had arrived second and forced the local consuls chosen by Pavia to stand down, again by force, per vim. Now, it's clear from all of this that a good deal of weight was placed on force. The phrase per vim was intended to mean illegitimately, but force is a double-edged weapon in this period. Force that is not opposed was regarded by 12th century Italians, including judges and arbiters, as a proof of right. If you forced a rival off contested land and they did not fight back or at once appeal to a court, a tribunal, you had a prima facie right to the property. And so if you forced a local consul to swear to you and they let you, then you had more right to do it again. So when in the 1160s, Pavia swore in local consuls quietly, the word quietly is doing a good deal of work. And witnesses sometimes name powerful people from Piacenza who stood by and let them do so. Conversely, when Piacenza forced locals to swear to the city and deposed local consuls who did not, and Pavia let them do so, it was Pavia that lost both legal ground and local consensus, which had legal weight. And that's also where some of the more subtly undermining stories had power as well, as when witnesses said that in Mondonico, in the early 1180s, a consul of Pavia trying to challenge Piacenza simply found 2 men in a field taking wine barrels down to the Po and swore them in as local consuls on the spot by force until the Piacentini made them stand down. So there's an image of arbitrariness here and failed arbitrariness, and that's intentional. So broadly, Pavia had the worst of it in recent years, and a city consul from Pavia admitted that recently the villagers obeyed Piacenza more, but would rather obey Pavia if the latter could defend them, which evidently it couldn't. But one thing is very clear. There's no settled practice in any time in the 25 years before 1184 in the raising of local consuls in any of these places. And that absence of settled practice meant that both cities had to try harder. A few witnesses who said they had raised consuls in some or all of the villages were not city consuls themselves. They were smaller scale operators, officials. That's increasingly normal in communal Italy. Should mostly have been here as well, because consuls don't have to do this, shouldn't have to do this. As a city consul, you send a representative to do the city's work. It's not only unnecessary to go yourself, but impossible. Otherwise, you'd spend the entire year going from village to village, installing consuls of all the rural communes of a contado, when you had other ruling to do. So the fact that the consuls of each city themselves appear in these otherwise unimportant villages so often is a marker of the difficulty each city had in getting their position accepted. Now, that's partially because it's a contested frontier, but it's also a sign of the wider need of cities to build up consensus everywhere in the countryside before power can be routinized, which is a process that hasn't really begun. And until power is routinized, it's a lot more work. I'll come back to that. Now, taxes, more briefly, cities collected taxes when they installed local consuls, so the history of taxation has a similar storyline and a similar set of assumptions about the legal role of force. But there's one point that I think is useful to make here about the long accounts of tax paying in the witnessing, is the role of pledges in them. Juvaticum and fodrum were exacted in fixed and predictable sums of money, not necessarily large sums. But it was frequent for Piacenza in particular to send men to take pledges for future payment of tax from villagers. These pledges had force because they were of far higher value than the actual tax due. So a sword was taken in pledge for 6 denarii. 10 solidi were taken in pledge for a tax of 1 solidus. As can be seen, these pledges are random. What they meant was that the armed men of Piacenza, in effect, came and took what they chose, and then the taxpayer had to journey to the city to pay his tax to get the goods back, if indeed he managed it, because sometimes people got the pledge back and sometimes they didn't. So here in the countryside before 1184, exacting tax is often much more like arbitrary requisitions in wartime. You just come and grab pledges, and then you can sort it out in a more legal way later. That's a very simple way of expressing power by force, but you don't get much consensus out of it, and it's the opposite of being routinized. And furthermore, you need an army detachment to grab pledges on this scale. Now, I mean, it's not that anyone then or ever paid tax willingly, but it's new in this period, so especially unwelcome, and it's felt to be an arbitrary and external imposition with no real system. This sense of city power as not just external, but unwelcome, extends into justice. The development of urban judicial power in both of the contadi, that is to say, the requirement to do justice not only before city officials, but also routinely in the city, has an analogous pacing to swearing in consuls and taxation. I've already mentioned the account of the probably unwilling cession to Pavia by the abbot of San Sepolcro of his judicial rights in San Marzano. Other villages were aware of parallel changes as well. Several said, for example, that before Arnaldo Barbavaria was the German podesta in Piacenza in 1162-4, neither Pavia nor Piacenza had any judicial rights in San Marzano. Now, the 1160s is actually fairly early for this in most of Italy. the first inroads in Parma of the city commune against the signoria of the Bishop of Parma were not for another 30 years. But in these 5 villages, city communal jurisdiction, which was often exercised, didn't always feel like a normal process. It's simply depicted as people being forced to go into the city by messengers because someone has raised a plea against them. Witnesses are constrained to go into the city as well. And similarly, city criminal justice, which is more often done on the spot in these villages, was frequently seen as imposed. So when Ottolino di Alda of Pieve Parpenese killed Gualterino Mormano, a witness stated that a consul of Piacenza came to take pledges about this from Ottolino's brother Uberto, as Ottolino had fled. Uberto said he didn't owe any legal obligation because he wasn't part of the judicial area of Piacenza. So the consul simply broke into his strongbox, which Uberto kept in the local church, took its contents and left. Uberto only ever got part of that back. Now, the point is, before this, justice was essentially local. Lords controlled justice inside most lordships, formally or informally. They had local status. They certainly did in the 12th and 13th century, that they always routinely ran justice through local bailiffs and local elites who were known to peasants. Peasant landowners, who were not subject to seigneurial lords before 1100 or so, perhaps had always resorted to arbitration. They still did that often enough in the 12th century. These are standard and long-standing patterns. So when the cities started to demand that a range of cases be heard inside the city before city consuls, as both Pavia and Piacenza did from the 1160s onwards, peasants and other villagers were not grateful. City judges took it for granted that their justice was more professional than and superior to that of rural amateurs and of lords who would not judge against themselves. Historians have often believed them. But from the peasant standpoint, the norms of justice were being taken away from them and people they knew and handed over to strangers who might judge by different rules. And of course, cities were not close by. Piacenza was 20-25 kilometers away from these villages. Pavia was 25 to 30 across a large river. Hearings did not necessarily end in a single day. They involved time and expense, which is another burden. It will take a long time for these procedures to be normal. So this is what the conquest of the contado meant to villagers. It was far from a heroic process when seen from the countryside. It involved the imposition of 2 new and unwelcome burdens, random taxation and city-based justice. Neither were obviously better, milder than seigneurial power before, where it was exercised. Urban power was locally interfering. The city's raising of local consuls was less of a financial burden, but it still imposed from above by force in villages which did not appreciate the need for it. Now, it's not that these villages didn't recognize urban authority at all. Almost all witnesses were at least implicit supporters of one side or the other. They did not see themselves as ideally autonomous. They said things like, "We are more of Pavia than of Piacenza," or vice versa. In Monticelli, they said to a consul of Pavia, I quote, "We are very surprised that you let us be forced by the men of Piacenza, as we are yours." Unquote. In Olmo, when men from Piacenza's neighbouring castle of Olubra came to buy goods, the men of Olmo demanded to be paid in the money of Pavia, not Piacenza. Again, a quote, "Since I want to spend it in my territory, since I am of the territory of Pavia." But it did not mean that they appreciated the exercise of urban power. They're a bit like the Italian cities facing Barbarossa. He might be legally in the right, but he took too much and too arbitrarily. Now, of course, these villages have no hope of resistance, and they know it. Even though actual violence is seldom involved, and whether or not villagers thought that rule by cities had actually advantages, which it's hard to see here, but could be a feature of rural reactions elsewhere, cities will henceforth win. But, and this is my final point, the other point is winning was not enough. I've already implied arbitrary power was simple. Armed men simply taking things from villages. You don't need to calculate exact rights. But it involved more people, more work, because consensus was not achieved. Now, of course, city communes had armed forces. They used them all the time. But they could not intimidate every village in a contado at once. Once a city commune did not have rivals, which were a military threat, the key challenge was to gain consent and to regularize. Peasants greatly valued regularization in their obligations so that they could plan ahead. That's why they were prepared to pay substantial sums for franchises, franchigie from seigneurial lords, to make lordly exactions standard and predictable. Cities were the same. An intelligent city leader knew that governing with consent was cheaper if it could be achieved. So in Lucca, for example, which had a notably higher level of consent in the part of its contado which it controlled fully, about half the old diocese, our evidence from court proceedings shows that already in the later 12th century, a single minor city official, perhaps with a couple of armed men, could make court decisions real in the countryside. That's somewhere that Pavia and Piacenza have not reached yet, at least out here at the edge of their territories. But, to conclude, they would. And when they did, such routinization is, for me, a more important process than the other more famous markers of communal development, the appearance of podestà, of legislation, the rise of the popolo in the late 13th century. Other cities reached this point earlier, some later, but by the mid-13th century, almost all would. I've already said the routinization of power had one crucial spin-off. It was less work. It was not necessary to use consuls and armed detachments to make the point about swearing in village leaders or taxation or army service every year. Ordinary officials in ones and twos could do it, and people got used to it. It was that all cities aimed for by now, and little by little they managed it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Chris. Vamos a abrir una sesión de preguntas. Cualquiera que quiera hacer una pregunta se tiene que acercar al micrófono que tenemos aquí. ¿Está abierto?
Sí.
¿Sí?
Sí.
No. Así, ok. Muchas gracias por la exposición. Thank you very much for your conference, Chris. We have some question in the chat. Wait a moment.
¿Quieres leerlas?
No, ¿acá en español?
No, en inglés.
Bueno, bien acá.
Oh, okay. Hi, Professor. I'm going to read the question on the chat. Laura Carbo says, Professor Wickham, you mentioned arbitration between cities. Is there documentation, sources of these processes? Who were the arbiters? And sorry if she misunderstood something that you already mentioned. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the arbitration process, I mean, part of the documentation is this witnessing. But we do have the beginning and the end of many arbitrations. what seems to happen is that individual cities choose judges, sometimes equal numbers of judges from the two cities, sometimes judges from other potentially neutral cities, but certainly professional judges. And they entrust the arbitrations to these professionals, and then ideally they accept the arbitration that these judges make. Sometimes these arbitrations are organized by the Lombard League. Sometimes they're also organized by the emperor, at times at which the emperor is in Italy. But the important thing is that they're neutral arbitrations, and we do have the formal documents for them, or for some of them.
Okay, thank you. No, esa sola.
¿Alguien de la sala que quiera preguntar algo? No questions.
Se puede preguntar en español también.
Español.
Se puede preguntar en español también. Sí. Acércate, Carlos, porque el micrófono está... Carlos, hasta ahorita no...
¿Acá?
Sí. Sí.
Ok. Hola.
Hola.
Yo quisiera preguntarte, ¿cómo caracterizás vos en conjunto estos sistemas de comunas y contados que en una época se los veía como formas opuestas al feudalismo? Después se los vio como unas formas de modernización temprana en el feudalismo. ¿Cómo harías vos una caracterización general de estos sistemas? Y si ves alguna relación entre estos sistemas con formas económicas como la mesadria en la Toscana. Bien, gracias.
Bueno. Una pregunta muy compleja al final. A un nivel, no creo que las comunas sean antifeudales. Una característica de casi todos los comunes de ciudades es que los cónsules y después los podestá sean de familias terratenientes con derechos feudales que ellos tienen también, que las ciudades han decidido que no sean hostiles, contrarios al poder local de las ciudades. Es decir, que en un sentido, una comuna de ciudad es una versión del feudalismo más colectivo, menos y menos jerárquico. Pero no es en sí mismo antifeudal. El desarrollo económico viene después. Sobre todo en el siglo XIII, aún no enteramente, excepto en Génova y Pisa y Venecia, que no hace parte del reino de Italia. Y en estas tres ciudades el poder comercial es extremadamente fuerte, pero en otras ciudades mucho menos hasta el siglo XIII. Es solamente en el siglo XIII que formas económicas en las campañas comienzan a comparar, como has dicho, el sistema de mesadía. Pero en el siglo XII mucho menos. Es aún, se puede decir, es aún un mundo feudal.
Okay. ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿No hay más preguntas? Bueno, entonces, si usted quiere agregar algo más, Chris, si quieres agregar algo más. Lo que a
Bueno.
nosotros...
Estoy feliz. Habría debido decirlo antes. Estoy feliz de poder venir al menos a un nivel electrónico a este convenio. Y bueno, espero que todo vaya bien.
Muchísimas gracias por tu participación. Es un gusto y un honor contar con tu presencia, aunque sea virtual aquí. Lamentamos que no hayas podido venir a la Argentina, pero bueno, esperamos que en una próxima ocasión puedas venir. Y además de charlar...
Espero yo también.
Exacto. Además de charlar, nos tomamos un vino. Te mandamos un abrazo muy grande y nuevamente muchas gracias por haber estado con nosotros.